Nice to see you all. We are now heading into a kind of a different section of the Torah. This week we're reading Parshat Mishpatim, which means laws or rules. And indeed, that's what Parshat Mishpatim is. It's just this big catalog of laws. Ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. These are the laws that you should that you place before the people. Now, remember. Oh, Emma, can you put the closed caption bar down at the bottom of the system? Where was I? The laws. The laws that you put before the people. Now, this makes sense in some ways, right? We just read the great revelation at Mount Sinai. That was last week's Parsha, and that was accompanied by a set of laws as well, right? But just 10 laws. But law has now been, I mean, if we weren't expecting it, we would be perhaps surprised by the centrality of law in this narrative, right? Like, God comes to the people, and the thing that God offers is law. So that's already a big deal, the 10 Commandments. But then once we get into this parsha, it's not 10. It's like hundreds of laws. The beginning of what will be hundreds and hundreds of laws. The system that will make up the practice of our, of our religion. Okay, so that's where we're at. Now, I must say that for a lot of people, I think this is about where the Torah starts to get a little less interesting, right? Like, Genesis is spectacular all the way through, and then Exodus is almost better. I mean, it's just the epic nature of this narrative it transcends. Right? It's the greatest story ever told, right? They think that's Spielberg or something, but it is for the first 20 chapters, right? Oh, we're right up to the Revelation. Then all of a sudden, it's like everything grinds to a halt, and we're reading about oxes that gore other oxes and the kind of payment that you have to do in order. That's this week, okay? It's a whole new book. It feels like the Torah does this as well. Now, the change in style of the Torah might force us to think differently about how we're going to analyze how we're going to make sense of, how we're going to interpret the Torah once it turns into this system of laws. Like, that is, so far in looking at the stories of the Torah, if you've been with us at all on this journey, you know that one of the key devices, interpretive devices that we have at our disposal is something I think you might call intertextuality or intertextuality, right? Like, that is the way that this text references itself, right? There's stories that we look at and we see echoes from other stories, and there are linguistic connections that we make, and in some ways that's the heart of our interpretive tradition. That's the heart of the midrashic tradition, is to look for connections within the text. And we might think, well, that's gone now. Now we're going to do a different mode of interpretation. Now we're going to just think about the law, and what does the law mean, and how is the law to be applied? And isn't that, after all, the whole of the Talmudic discourse? Isn't that the whole of the halachic discourse that we have inherited? This is the point where Judaism becomes a legalistic religion, and we sort of leave behind all of the great stories that we've been reading so far. Well, not so. We won't be leaving them behind at all, because what I want to do today is to try and demonstrate what I think is one of the most interesting forms of legal analysis, which is to see the law as a commentary on earlier stories in the Torah. Okay, to see this catalog of laws not just as a rule book, but actually to see this section of the Torah as intertextual as well, and that is to see it as thinking back, referencing these laws themselves, conscious of the stories that have come before them, speaking to them a little bit. Okay, so that's the project today, and I'll demonstrate what I mean soon. Let's just say a blessing over our practice of studying the Torah. All right, let's say a blessing over Torah study today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so let me, I hope that didn't all sound too abstract and nonsensical. Let me demonstrate a little bit what I mean, and we're going to start slow, okay? Like I said, we got this whole new catalog of laws. Here's a source sheet for you. We have this whole new catalog of laws, and if we were to go into them, we might say, oh, let's take a breath and start doing legal analysis. But from the very first law, we can see that this isn't entirely disconnected from where we've come so far, right? The first law, in some way, this first glance at our Parsha today is going to be obvious. It's going to be easy work, right? Because the very first law is, here we are, Ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. These are the laws you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. Ki tikne eved ivri shesh shanim yavod uvashvit yetzeh lechofshi chinam. Okay, so this is a softball, but can someone just sort of indulge me? What's this law doing here? Why do we start our catalog of laws with the law? First of all, we don't like the idea, do we, that there actually are institutions of slavery in our own legal system. But there it is. What's the relationship between why suddenly consider the laws of the Hebrew slave who goes free in the 7th year? Anyone want to just speak that out for me, or is it too obvious? Noah?
Going for the obvious one, it's obvious that we just came out of Egypt. That's the obvious answer. So this has to be in the law code. But then again, if we didn't state the obvious law first, then it could have just been an implicit law that if the Israelites had slaves, then they treat them as the Egyptians treated us. But since this is clearly here, we have we know that if they fall on tough times and have to become an indentured servant or something, they can become free in the 7th year, or if they like that lifestyle for some reason, they can just stay on and renegotiate every 7 years or so.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. The obvious answer here is that they were slaves in Egypt, and so the laws they received immediately afterwards are a reflection, a processing, a reconsideration of that institution that they suffered under. And of course, we who live in the sort of the post-revolutionary era of history would want them to say, you were slaves in Egypt, slavery is wrong, no more slaves. But instead, it's a moderated version of that. And Noah's right to I think, to use the phrase indentured servitude. It's a little bit of a switching from what we now think of as slaves, completely owned, to something that is a kind of indentured servitude that eventually ends. And I suppose for this moment in time, is a kind of a move away from the most abusive forms of slavery, and so you can see now we're in the intertextual conversation. This is a law which reflects back immediately on the big story that we've been reading. I see my mom has a hand raised. A slave works, she says, for 6 years. And that reminds me of how in England, people were often sent as slaves to America to work for 6 years before they were freed and given property. And so it just reminds me of an earlier English system. So that's interesting. I'm not sure what system exactly, but I think you're right that there are, we can observe many systems in history that have laws around what it means to be a slave, what it means to be a servant, different forms of servitude, different forms, and by putting them in the language of law, even if they don't achieve what we imagine an ideal society wants, nevertheless, we understand that there's some attempt to regulate this system and perhaps to provide a little bit of justice to it. Okay. So that's like, you see this happening. You see the laws of the Torah as a kind of commentary on the earlier sections of the Torah. And okay, maybe that's like not so surprising. Maybe it's obvious, and also maybe it's just a first impression. Maybe it's it's just a way of kind of signaling with the first law, hey, this is, there's a little bit of a bridge between what has been and what will be. But I just want to point out that the connection is even stronger than just a thematic connection. There is indeed even a linguistic or kind of a lexical connection here. And we see it in Noah was talking about this before, the declaration of the slave who goes free in the 7th year. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain his slave for life. Okay, so if the slave doesn't want to leave, the slave has the choice to stay, but has to go perform this strange ritual. Now, I'll read it in Hebrew. Omar yomar ha'eved ahavti et adoni vet ishti vet banai lo etze chofshi. I don't want to go free. V'higishu adonav el ha'elohim v'higishu el hadelet o el hamezuzah v'ratza adonav et osno b'martzea b'avdo la'olam. Okay, so now what do we see here that reminds us of something we've seen before? Okay, what do we have? Well, this is in this sort of strange conclusion to the law. What hearkening back are we seeing? There's some institution there that we have seen before. Joe Schwartz?
The mezuzah, the doorpost.
That's right. Good. Yeah. There's going to be a little bit of a pop quiz like feature in this class, because we're going to try to be doing a little bit of spotting the connection. And Joe is right here. The connection here is the mezuzah, the doorpost, which we know we've seen before famously during the passing over of the Exodus, the final plague, in which the Israelites are told to take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that's in the basin to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. Okay, the mezuzot. The very custom of a mezuzah that we have on our own doors is a hearkening back to the Exodus story. But surely this now, the second usage, where we have the slave who doesn't want to go free has to go to the mezuzah and perform this ritual at the mezuzah. So now it's not just a thematic connection. There's a real direct link. What do we make of that? What is the connection between the mezuzah of Passover and the mezuzah of the slave's ear? Let's see, Sally.
Well, to start with, they're both putting blood on the doorpost. If you slam an awl into someone's ear, you have blood on that doorpost, and we had blood there. Also, they talk about leaving, if he loves his wife and child, that implies that he has to leave them when he, if he goes. And there's some connection between losing children and the death of the firstborn, and just
yeah, great. That's a great connection I didn't think of. That's right. So first of all, Sally imagines this ritual and imagines, oh, when you bang his ear into a door, strange as it is, blood on the doorpost, just like blood on the door of the, so there's more of a, there's something of kind of a reenacting of the Passover scene. And during that scene, Sally says, there are children that are dying, people being separated from their children, and that, in a sense, is one of the things that this servant is reckoning with. So how do we factor that theme into our analysis of this connection? Okay, Joni.
Thank you. I was thinking about the Mezuzah as it's a community event, and it's a visual event, seeing the Mezuzah, and the ear is really saying, don't be deaf to the freedom that you are being given. And it's such a unlikely, I mean, the penalty is so harsh that even if one were to consider the comfort or whatever reason they wouldn't want the freedom, you can't do it. You've got to leave. You've got to pack up and go.
Okay, that's great, Joni. What Joni says is almost perfectly a kind of an echo of Rashi's comments. Rashi, our great commentator's comments on this scene. Rashi says, "Why the ear? Why is this person being marked in the ear?" And Rashi says, "Ozen sheshama bahar Sinai," the ear that heard at Mount Sinai that you shall be my servants forever, and then instead took a human servant. That ear is being marked because you've been deaf to the message, right? Here's Rashi and a sort of continuation of that thought. He comments on the mezuzah as well. In what respect, says Rashi, are door and doorpost different from all other objects in the house, that they should be singled out for this purpose? God, in effect, said, door and doorpost were eyewitnesses in Egypt when I passed over the lintel and the two doorposts, freeing Israel from slavery. And when I said, for unto me the children of Israel are servants, servants to me, but not servants of servants, that is, servants of human beings. And yet this man went and procured another master for himself. Let him be not pieced, but pierced in their presence. So you can see Joni brucha shekivant, as they say. Joni's has interpreted it exactly as Rashi has, which is considered a badge of honor in our interpretive tradition. But we've made the point, okay? Like Rashi is what we've been doing. Rashi sees this too. It's in some ways, as we said, and as Noah echoed, it's obvious. There's an obvious connection here. So that's already just interesting. We got this catalog of laws, and the first one makes an obvious reference to earlier in the story. Okay, so that's the setup. But that much, I think, you could have done yourself, and you probably have done, some of you. Yeah, I've looked at this before. It's the first law in Mishpatim. Every year, rabbis are talking about this. Okay, like, why are we talking about it so thoroughly again? Well, as I said, this is a setup, or you're not being set up. This is to set up the conversation, because I want to give us a couple of other examples that I think are less obvious. In fact, some of them you might not be immediately convinced by, but I want to make the case that the laws of the book of Exodus are doing this all the time. The laws of the book of Exodus, and eventually the laws of Deuteronomy as well, are often very directly reflecting back on the stories of the book of Genesis in particular, and offering some kind of commentary, some kind of reflection on. Now, Rashi has just made sense of the connection that we made. You might interpret it differently, but our job here is not necessarily to give the exact correct interpretation, but just to make the connections so that we see them and can offer our own understanding of what they might be. So let me move us to the next law that I think evokes an earlier scene, and this one I imagine will be more difficult to identify. It took me a while, so let's take a look here. Okay, we are in, just to make clear, chapter 21 of the book of Exodus. That's where Parshat Mishpatim starts. And here's chapter 21, just 12 lines in, okay? So laws keep clicking down. We're reading a list of laws, and we get to, this is in some ways a classic, an important one. It is the punishment for murder. So, make ish vamet mot yumat. He who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death. Okay, death penalty. But if he did not do it by design, but it came about by an act of God, I will assign you a place to which he can flee. Okay, this is going to become a major institution in Jewish law, the city of refuge is the first mention of it. And then finally, when a man schemes against another and kills him treacherously, you shall take him from my very altar to be put to death. Okay, and just notice these two lines, these are two cases, right? Two cases of someone who has killed someone else. The first one is he didn't mean to, and in that case, he will flee. And the second one is that he did, he intended to, and in that case, he deserves the death penalty. Now, is there anything in this scene that reminds you of where we've been before? Does this sound like any of the stories that we've read before? Anyone have a guess here? Anyone have a thought? I see Matt Silberstein does, yeah.
Obviously, it's Moses. Moses, who killed someone by accident and had to flee. So that's certainly the one that comes immediately to my mind.
Good. That's certainly an instance of someone killing and fleeing. Yes. And
doesn't Jacob flee?
Great. That is the other right. Good. So Matt, great work. Moses, it's true, kills someone and flees. And let's think about that let's hold that, because that might be a part of this law's reflection also. But it's the other connection that Matt made, the connection back to Jacob, that I want to stay with for a moment. Because Jacob also had to flee, though Jacob didn't kill anyone, right? Jacob tricked his brother. Jacob stole his blessing from his father by acting like his brother. In fact, his brother wanted to kill him, and Jacob had to flee for that reason. So it's not a direct connection. It seems like there's some of the same things are going on, but it's enough for Matt to say, I remember Jacob fleeing. Jacob had to flee. So Matt says it's obviously Moses, and he's right in some ways, but there's a connection to Jacob too. Now, I want to just make the connection to why not go to Moses? Matt's right. Moses is the more obvious parallel. Why am I dwelling on Jacob? It's because of this word here. And this is really quite something, quite difficult, I think, to notice. This word here. And in the English, it's schemes, like plans, plots, schemes. Ki yazid ish al re'ehu lehargo. When a man schemes against another and kills him treacherously. So intentional act of treachery versus the earlier accidental, I didn't mean to, okay? Now, this word, ki yazid, when a man schemes, is only used previously one other time in the Torah. Anyone know what it is? You do if you've just scrolled down.
Are you going for the nazid?
That is right.
Okay.
That is right. When the boys grew up, this is Jacob and Esau. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. Now, once when Jacob was preparing a stew, Esau came in from the open famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Give me some of that red stuff to gulp down, for I am famished," which is why he was named Edom. Edom means red. Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "I'm at the point of death, so of what use is my birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob then gave Esau the bread and lentil stew. There's that word again. Let's highlight it again. Nazid. And he rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. Now, oh my gosh, I don't know if I heard a little bit of an incredulity in Yonatan's voice, but you might say, I'm really want us to think about the stew? The stew, for goodness sake? Now, it is true, it is the only use of this verb before we see it in our law. And it is related. It is related. It's not just a homophone. In fact, Jacob was preparing a prepared dish, the preparation, the scheming, right? Something which is intentionally acted out and done, okay? A deliberate act, and that's why Yazed and Nazid are used here and here, because in both cases, someone is doing something intentionally. But okay, now we've got something to think about, because, I mean, I listen, I'm okay to you pushing back, but I want to try and make the case that these two scenes are connected. First of all, we have Jacob's unusual use of this same verb, and then Jacob eventually has to flee, as Matt noticed. "Now, my son, listen to me. Flee at once to Haran." Why? Because Esau is planning to kill you. And if that weren't enough, there's one other linguistic echo in the law, and that is the earlier verse said, if he did not do it by design, asher lo tzada, he didn't trap him. And this same word tzada, that's an Esau word. Esau was someone who knew, what's the language in the English? This is a bad translation. He had a taste for game, but he was a hunter, right? A man of the, he was a skillful, here it is, a skillful hunter. So, okay, it's a little bit of a mess, but I think I want to try and make the case that connection is there. There's a connection between the scheming of the murderer and the scheming of Jacob, and so I want to turn to you and ask, what do we do with that? Are you convinced? And if so, what do we do? Is there a connection between this law and the earlier story? All right, I'm going to let Yonatan pick up on this because you were the one that guessed the connection. What do you think, Yonatan?
I mean, yes, you did hear incredulity in my voice, and I am now convinced. So, well done. No, I think these mishpatim are not really about these mishpatim, right? And they're not by any metric. Yes, true. Like literally, if a shore gores your neighbor, then like these mishpatim lay out what you're supposed to do, but all of them are intended to stand in for other things. I think that's just really clear. And in this case, I think you've laid out a persuasive case that this is about premeditation, right? And the understanding that the same act when done by tzayid, right? The hunting, when done like spontaneously, just isn't the same morally as an act that's done with premeditation. Okay, look, I just convinced Yonatan, everybody. It's like it's a banner day in Parsha Nut. What do other people think? And Yonatan begins to offer some interpretation of okay, so the law is talking about the difference between premeditation and accidental damage. Okay, so but how do we think back to the Jacob and Esau story with these themes in our mind? What does the law have to say about Jacob and Esau? What are we being taught here? Alexandra?
I think it's about discernment, because there is a link, then there is, as you explained, the premeditation and premeditation, but the acts are very different. And I think it's about the importance of paying attention to nuance and subtlety. Esau, after he ate, he got up and left. Like, he didn't care anymore. He disregarded this. This meant nothing to him. This was an act of his own volition. And even after he was no longer hungry, he didn't go, oh, wait a minute. Hey, let's renegotiate this. He decided later to kill his brother. So I think it's a very different type of premeditation. And I think it speaks to the importance of discernment and nuance and subtlety within judging legal cases.
Okay, so this is good. I mean, I think we are, so far, I think we're agreed that it is important to distinguish, to factor intention into our assessment of a crime. And we still do this, right? There's the difference between first degree murder and involuntary manslaughter and second degree murder, right? This is a principle in the law. But again, and Alexandra begins to think about, well, okay, so when we look at Jacob and Esau, which of them was scheming? Which of the two of them had designs on the other? Now, I don't know. On the one hand, you might say, well, isn't Esau the villain of the story? And he wanted to kill Jacob. He intended to kill Jacob. He had a plan to kill Jacob. So he's the intentional killer. Whereas Jacob, well, I don't know. Did Jacob, how is Jacob scheming, not scheming? Is Jacob intentional, not intentional? I mean, how do we map this back onto the story? And if I can make the question a little stronger, let me just point out that in the original law, the one who did not do it by design, we use the language of entrapment, which is an Esau word. Esau was the hunter. But the one who did do it by design, Yazid, well, that's the word that Jacob is performing in the earlier scene. So that's a little confusing. Esau seems to be the link to the sort of innocent or less culpable person is a link to Esau. The link to the schemer who does it by design is a direct and very unusual link to Jacob's particular act of preparing. So how do we make sense of that? How do we map these back onto Esau and Jacob? Randy Weiss?
So, Rabbi, I was thinking about a different word, a different use of the word Nazir, which comes later in the Torah, which is the Nazarite. Isn't that, is that not the same?
Different word, Nazir, Nazid, with a dalet. Yeah, different.
Okay.
Okay.
Then my point is a bad point. But
yeah, fair enough. Wendy Becker. Oh, well, let's wait.
There,
we'll
I got it.
Oh, there you are.
I'm sorry. So there are a few things, several things that come to mind from various points in our discussion today. First of all, dealing with Jacob and Esau, we're talking about a different kind of murder. Jacob killed Esau's story of life, what his life story was supposed to be, his birthright, and it was a murder of a different sort. And so how do we equate physical and emotional? You know, it can be similar. And this is, I think, a little bit what Torah's on another level might be saying. But I think all of this, when you were talking about the comparison or the similarity between Moses and Yaakov, between Jacob, both of these people who committed a murder in a sense had to flee, had to go into the wilderness. But let me take it a step before that. When we were talking about the door, how being in the doorway is when is the doorway is this place that is a point of demarcation. We are going from one place to another. This is a very holy act that we do every day, going from one place to another. As Jews, I think that the notion of the doorway, marking it, having the slave, having that particular ceremony done in the doorway is also very significant, because that slave is going from one part of their life to another. It is making a statement about what their life will be. So to go into the doorway and have that done is very profound.
Okay.
I think, but I think it's also, I think that is a significant also for us as a people, because constantly I think we're being reminded of our own necessity of evolution within our lives, going from one place to another, and to mark it, to mark our changes. And that's why the doorway is so important. And
I
the
want to
wilderness, there's a lot. Okay.
I know there's a ton. But you're going to new places, and so before you go too far, I want to really seize on the first thing you said, because you said so insightfully, and it's something that I think we have to keep in mind, which is that Jacob does scheme. I mean, what is Jacob but a schemer, right? So like, Jacob didn't kill his brother. He didn't. I mean, Esau didn't kill his brother either. In the end, there was no murder back then. But Jacob did, by design, as Wendy puts it, take his brother's life force, his life path. Jacob ruined his brother's life and did so through strategy, through kind of deal making. I'm hearing background noise. Who's got their, I'm hearing like video game noises. Here we go. Sally, that was your, and now Rivka, your, okay. Lots of muting and unmuting today. So try and keep that off just for sound reasons. Jacob does scheming, plotting, and Esau, I mean, I just want to fill in the rest of the thought. Esau definitely schemes. Esau designs to kill his brother. But there is a way in which we might say that Jacob is the one who plotted and planned, and Esau is the one who almost is like reacting involuntarily. There's just something about Esau's action that is like being driven to the edge. Like, we don't say that someone who committed an act of a murder as an act of passion, that person, that's not involuntary, but it is different than someone who premeditated and planned, right? So it's like, there is a way in which we can look back at the Jacob and Esau story and say, well, okay, nobody died there, but Jacob was the one who was like planning to ruin his brother's life. And maybe actually, as we look back at that story, we're not so comfortable with how that played out. Okay, so that sort of reflection, I think it's not just that the law might offer a straightforward assessment of, well, what are the facts of the case? But actually, I think it's deeper than that the law might actually be commenting on the story. It might actually be saying something new and even subversive about the story that we've read in the past, okay? All right, let's see. Esra, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I was going to say precisely what Wendy said.
Okay, great.
And you have now said, which, except to also add the lens of power. In my mind, Jacob started the fire, you know, he kind of set the first domino. And, you know, he was scheming in terms of power and progeny. I guess the only thing I'm confused about, I'm okay having a question, I don't need to have an answer, but is what, you know, how do these laws that come after, like, what's the Kasher here? I guess I'm struggling, like, you've given us these texts and like, what's the connection between, you know, whatever Jacob has done, you know, he intentionally schemed in a way that kind of basically cut off the life, you know, the progeny moving forward. So what was his punishment? Did he pay a price? You know, what is Mishpatim telling us about that? Is it telling us something about, back to your intertextuality, like, what's the nikuda, I guess, or the nikudot here? Yeah,
what is the point of all of this? Like, what does it mean to to analyze these laws and search for ways that they might be reflecting back on the earlier story. I mean, we've done it twice now. We've done like a law about a servant who wants his servitude and therefore will be taken to the mezuzah that was the very symbol of the release from servitude in an earlier story. And then we've seen a story, a law that is talking about intentional versus unintentional harm, and the ways in which that law seems also to be hearkening back to an earlier story, which has themes of scheming and fleeing and life in peril. But Ezra is right to ask, well, what is there a method here? Is there a way of looking at these stories as commenting back on the earlier scenes? I think I want to answer that by just doing it one more time. Okay, I want to give us one more story to quickly look through and make a connection. And then once we've got three in front of us, then I want to return to this question, like, what's going on here? What are the laws of the Torah doing here? And I will just say, Yonatan in some ways has already began to give us an answer. Yonatan said something very radical, sort of in passing. He said, oh, that's what all of the laws of the Torah are for. They're less about law than they are about.
I said the laws of this section.
Of this section of the Torah.
Yeah.
They're less about actually creating a legal system and more about asserting principles. And maybe asserting principles that indeed reflect back on where we've been so far. Okay, let's just do it one more time. Well, just one more time. We could do it again and again. And mostly what I wanted to do today was just offer you a method that we might use when looking at the laws of the Torah. But let's just do it one more time here. This is in one chapter, okay? Chapter 21. So this won't be hard. Here's an easy one. V'gonev ish umachro v'nimtza biyado mot yumat. He who kidnaps a man, whether he has sold him or is still holding him, shall be put to death. Okay, now that's not hard, right? What connection are we making there? He who kidnaps someone and may have sold him. Everybody knows, Carol's raising her hand. She knows it's Joseph, right? It's Joseph. Joseph was the one that was kidnapped by his brothers and indeed sold. So now wait a minute. Is this really a comment on that earlier story? Or is it just sort of like, yeah, the kidnapping's illegal, murder's illegal, they did bad things in the book of, is this really a direct reference back? Well, okay, let me try and make, right, for those of you who are dubious, let me try and once again, let's see if Yonatan will be convinced here. Because after all, it's a very generic law in some ways. Kidnapping is wrong. Selling people is wrong. That might have been a widespread practice at the time. Okay, well, let's go back to the Joseph story. Now, there is a little bit of a connection here, you know, this word here, whether he is still holding him, v'nimtza biyado. Well, that language does appear in the Joseph story here when they had taken the ornamented tunic to their father and they said, we found this, please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not? So the we found this is the same language, matzanu, as the found in his hand or still holding him. But I don't know. That's not a very strong connection, is it? I mean, those are two very common, that's a very common word. You can't say every time that something is found that it is a connection. I mean, we did want to go back to the Joseph story, but I don't know, that might be a stretch. But let's take a look at the last line in this scene. Now, this is the scene where the brothers take Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a little goat, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, we found this, please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not? Jacob recognized it and said, my son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast. Taraf Yosef. Very emphatic language there. Torn was Joseph. Okay? Now we're going to go back into Parshat Mishpatim and look at another law. Now take a look at this law. When a man gives to another a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to guard, and it dies or is injured or is carried off, with no witness about. An oath before the Eternal shall decide between the two of them that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. The owner must acquiesce and no restitution shall be made. But if the animal was stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. And then look at this line. If it was torn by beasts, he shall bring it as evidence. He need not replace what has been torn by beasts. Now look over at the Hebrew here. This language is very unusual. Im tarof yitaref. If it was torn apart by beasts, then they bring it, yavehu ad trefa lo yishalem. They can bring it as evidence because they don't have to pay for that. This double language of being torn apart, again, we only see in one other place in the Torah, and that is in the tearing apart of Joseph in Jacob's imagination. Okay? So if a beast has been torn apart, you bring it as evidence and you don't have to pay for it. Here, they are bringing evidence of Joseph's death, and Jacob responds that Joseph has been torn apart. Now, are you convinced? Is that a connection? I see some people not, some people yes. Look, that's okay. I am not, the point of this class is not to prove to you that I know all the right connections between the laws and the stories, but just to say that there are connections and we should be searching for them. And I think I have found one here. So if I want to make that claim, that there's some connection between the tearing apart of an animal, right, and the bringing of an animal that's been torn apart, and that earlier Joseph story where Jacob is saying that his son has been torn apart, what is the connection there? How is there a connection between those two stories? What do people think? We haven't heard from Payam yet.
I think what we're saying is that laws also have narrative, that there's moral relativism. Genesis is the story of farmers conquering hunters. So back then we had to do X, Y, and Z, but then the hunters have been conquered and we're new people and we no longer can do those same things. So that's why you see, like in the Jacob and Esau story, Jacob is the hero for scheming, but since Esau has been defeated, we can no longer scheme because we're better now. And if we did it, then we would turn into our enemies. So don't turn into your enemies.
Okay, I think that, yeah. So Payam is turning us to the question of what's going on here? What is the role of the law as commentary on Genesis? And Payam says something that I think we ought to consider seriously, which is that the whole, like, one law or another, we might figure out what the connection is, but the larger point is that the world of Genesis was a world without law. It was chaos, and terrible things happened all the time, and there was no means for regulation. And this is a new world. This is a world in which we're going to try and negotiate these conflicts that kept arising in more intimate ways in the book of Genesis. We're going to try and think about what principles are at stake that keep resulting in calamity, in pain, in conflict. So in the days of Joseph's brothers, well, they brought this coat and they tricked their father into thinking that it was Joseph. They didn't bring the animal. They didn't bring the evidence. Right? There are no rules about what exactly they had to bring. They just sort of, they figured out a way to make the story go the way they wanted. But this law in the book of Exodus is saying, no, you can be exonerated of a crime, but you have to prove it. You have to really prove it. You have to bring the animal, not just the blood on the coat, right? Because we know from the earlier story that you can fake that, right? So that might be one way of thinking about what Exodus is doing to Genesis. Is Exodus is looking back at Genesis and saying, you know what part of the problem is we had no rules back then. And we need to start thinking about the ways in which we screwed up and how we might manage some of those natural human worst tendencies now that we're beginning to form a larger society. Jen Bailey Guerra.
And Kaya was making a guest appearance there for a second.
Oh, cool.
My pup. You know, I really love, from a poetic and a literary perspective, making these connections. And I also love what it says about how we think about God, because if we think of these as laws that were given by God, but they're laws that are informed by narrative and story that we have to contextualize, that aren't absolute in the same sense that we would think of like totally abstract from completely outside of the story of the specific people laws. I really enjoy that. I think there's a lot theologically at stake with that methodology.
I feel a big but coming.
And well, it's a big and.
Okay.
It's a big and. And I want to be cautious about it pulling us into ignoring the humanity of the way that those laws actually impact people. Because after all, we started out with someone having to decide whether to leave his wife and children behind forever in order to no longer be a slave. Yeah. And so like it's very easy to take, and we see that in like right the way the Supreme Court's methodology and methodological disagreements can lead to inhuman ruling. So like I want to embrace the theology and the poetry of what we're doing here, but like with a lot of caution.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Each of these laws, these are, I think they call them casuistic. These are case laws, right? Like when you're in this situation, and some of these situations are just horrifying. I mean, just really like when a woman is sold by her father into like some kind of wife-like slavery to another man, and then that man finds her distasteful, he can't send her out into the desert, and it's like, oh, what's the law there? But hold on, what's going on to this like victimized, brutalized, completely powerless human being, right? And how good are these laws, right? All of those questions continue to be important questions that have to be asked on their own. And I think Jen is right to caution us from just sort of like, oh, look, these laws are just like a sort of a fun commentary on earlier stories, or an interesting or a literary commentary on earlier stories. What I do want to say a little bit in response to that is there is, I think, a way in which seeing the law as commentary on the earlier stories actually relieves us of some of the moral crisis in the law, because I think we can all agree that these laws don't go far enough. Right? Like, we want a law that says slavery is wrong. Right? Like, we've gotten to that place as a civilization where we've come to understand that. So why does the law only go a certain amount of the way? And I think we often say, well, you have to put it in its historical context, and it was progress for then, it's not now. But if you add to that this isn't just in its historical context, but actually very much in its narrative context, then at least for me, it means we can forgive the law a little bit more, because it is dealing with the problems that are right in front of it, and not necessarily yet the problems as we pan out and think about what would the greatest society look like. So that's not a total answer to Jen's concern, which stands, but I just, you know, I'll just say that I also am trying to think through the meaning of this sort of commentary beyond just the cool connection between a law and a story. Okay, let's take one more comment from Lila.
Yeah, I want to speak to something similar. I think there's a way of saying we had this sort of chaos before, and people were not held accountable, and now we have the system of laws to govern us and relieve some of this. But I think also it's just a necessity. I mean, we went from being clans, of people on our own to being like pushed into a kind of nationhood. And so we needed, to transition. And instead of seeing it only as like corrective, I think it's important to look at what's lost. And if you look at the Joseph story, it's like, well, what's the commentary there? That Joseph should not have forgiven his brothers. And there's this, like, as Jen was saying, this human, differently, but there's this human element there, like sometimes people are going to make the absolute wrong choices when they're not held accountable. And sometimes they're going to make these really beautiful choices when they can do it on their own, like to forgive. That's kind of like a radical forgiveness there. So I think there's a loss too.
Wow, that is such a profound point that you've made. It totally flips the the conversation on its head in some ways. I think that we have been considering the way that the law might be commentary on the earlier stories, and in that sense, acting as a kind of a critique or a corrective force. But Lila suggests that's I mean, or at least what I'm taking from what Lila said is that the stories have their function too. And actually, as we begin to get swept away into law, let's not forget that the stories are another way of processing these issues, and maybe a more nuanced, more human, more conscious of the human subject that stands before us. When we see these issues getting played out in stories, they can include forgiveness. They can include a decades-long process of a family trying to reconcile and sift through it isn't just like, well, you either wrong or right. You either do this or don't do that. Like, there's more to be gleaned, understood, and in some ways that is the function of this. The stories are not corrected by the law, as Lila frames it, but in fact, they're a reminder that the law doesn't fully account for the human experience. And that's really interesting as well. So fair enough, like let's not get too carried away with this method, but I hope at least you've seen that the two modes, and these are in some ways the two classic modes of Jewish discourse, narrative and law, are in dialogue with one another. There is some communication between our legal system and the stories which we carry with us. And you know, I'll make the point in the most obvious way. One of the laws that gets repeated again and again in this week's Parsha and throughout the Torah is the law to, we'll just skip to the end here, ger lo tilchatz, don't oppress a stranger. For you know the feelings of the stranger. Vatem yadatem et nefesh hager, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Right? There's something in the law that presumes that your earlier experience, not just your personal, but your historical memory, should inform the way that you are compelled to act in the world. Right? And that's foundational. Right? That in some ways develops our entire ethic of empathy and of compassion, and our ability to take our experiences and try and translate them into principles to live by. That is a part of our legal system. Exactly how that works and how the law comments on the narrative, I think, you know, suffice to say there are connections. I leave it to you to continue to interpret them. So we'll end here. Thanks everybody for joining me today, and I'll see you next week.